The perils of being in the survival situation and not knowing it. Pat is actually the one controlling the presentation today. So I'm going to be directing him on when to go to the next slide. Next slide, please. October 21, 1996. In Death Valley National Park, a helicopter discovered an abandoned vehicle. This was a National Park helicopter inspecting the land for drug laboratories, among other things, clandestine illegal activities. And this abandoned vehicle was 2.4 miles into Anvil Canyon. I have marked off on the map to the right the geography of Death Valley National Park and Anvil Canyon. Just for a point of reference, it is approximately 250-mile distance from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, just to give you an idea of the scale that we're working with here. This vehicle that they found was on an abandoned mining road. It was basically a mining road from way back in the day. It was the only way to cut through this area. Eventually, a different road was built, and this road was abandoned. The road was never all that great in the first place. It was... To call it a dirt road would be to elevate it at a higher level than it really was. It really was just sand and wash, particularly by this point. And what really surprised the National Park officers inside of the helicopter was that the area could only be traveled by a competent driver, and that competent driver would need a four-wheel drive vehicle. However, it was illegal to drive in this area due to some environmental restrictions they had. So it's definitely out of place, this vehicle that they found. Next slide, please. So the vehicle that they found was a 1996 Plymouth Voyager. If you think about just kind of like a classic 1990s minivan, that's what it was. This made it even more unusual, the van being there, due to the fact that what was a standard two-wheel drive passenger van doing in the middle of a pretty wild portion of Death Valley. Upon inspecting the van, he found that there were 3 flat tires. The 2 tires in the back and the tire in the front were all flat, and the van was sunk up to its axles in sand. The tracks behind the van suggested that it had been driven hundreds of feet with these flat tires. Upon running the plates on the van, they found that it was reported stolen by a rental company in California in September. Again, this was happening in October. And it had been rented by 4 German tourists in July. The van was originally due back in July. However, the rental company had a policy of waiting at least 30 days from the point of a vehicle needing to be returned to reporting it stolen. And if you look at the photo on the bottom, you can see this is pretty rugged terrain. There's like mountains and things in the background. Definitely not an area you'd want to be driving any kind of vehicle, much less a minivan. Next slide, please. So the individuals who were missing, upon looking up the records of the van itself, seeing who it was, they found an Interpol report for missing persons from Europe. These people were Egbert Rimkus, who was 34, and his son George, and then his Egbert's girlfriend Cornelia and her son Max. They had arrived in Los Angeles from Frankfurt on July 8th. They'd stayed in Southern California doing just typical tourist things until July 22nd. At that point, they checked in at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center in Death Valley. That's the main visitor center in Death Valley National Park on July 22nd. And just before they went into Death Valley, they requested additional funds from Germany. However, those funds were never sent. On the right, you can see the weather at the time that they were in Death Valley National Park. This is the weather at Furnace Creek, which is just about the hottest part of Death Valley. See highs in the 120s, lows in the 90s. The area where they found the van was an elevation of about 3,000 feet. And in Death Valley, usually every 1,000 feet up you go is a 5-degree drop in temperature. So the highs in the area that they were was probably more along the lines of 105 degrees, and the lows were probably more in the 70s. Next slide, please. But, regardless, very hot temperatures. Upon inspecting the van, they found an American flag labeled Butte Valley Stone Cabin found in the van. Butte Valley Stone Cabin is commonly known as the Geologist's Cabin and is a stocked shelter 4 miles west of Anvil Canyon. Anvil Canyon, again, being the location where the Germans were found. So we have some photos. You can see the inside and the exterior of the cabin. Really what's significant about this is that it showed that the Germans were at least aware that there was a good stocked shelter not a far distance from where their abandoned van was. So the thought among the National Park Rangers was that possibly they had gotten lost trying to trek back to this cabin from their vehicle once their vehicle got stuck. Next slide, please. They also inspected logbooks in the area, and they found a logbook from the Warm Spring mine site signed by the group. And Warm Spring is located between the Main Valley and Butte Valley. So that is, they need to travel from Furnace Creek Visitor Center and in their travels to the geologist's cabin and ultimately to Anvil Canyon, they would have gone to the Warm Spring mine site. I actually have a photocopy of the exact entry that they made. You can see they signed all of their names, and then in German, they wrote, "We are going over the pass." It's believed that they're referring to Mengel Pass, which is the only means by which to cross the Panamint Mountain Range for many miles. Panamint Mountain Range, you see on the map, the central green area is Death Valley. Just to the west is the Panamint Mountain Range. The Panamint Mountain Range sets the western boundary of Death Valley. So it appeared as if they were trying to leave Death Valley by means of the Mengel Pass, and that was their plan even before they got into any kind of potential survival situation. Because again, the Warm Spring mine site was another relatively stocked shelter. And they went to the geologist's cabin, which was again stopped after they signed this. However, the Mengel Pass is an extremely rugged route, and again is an area where you would need to be a competent driver with a 4-wheel drive vehicle. Next slide, please. So the National Park Service started a pretty intensive search at this point. On the first day of the search, they found a Bud Ice bottle, a beer, 1.7 miles east of the van. You can see actually in the photo, there's an arrow pointing at the bottle itself. It's kind of hard to see it, but that was the bottle. It was underneath a bush. This kind of surprised investigators because, again, they figured that the group would try to head west to the shelter that they had just been at if they're in any type of survival situation. From examining the ground around the bush, they determined that it was a lone individual who was at the bush and that they rested underneath the bush because there were imprints from them resting underneath the bush. So potentially they'd gone out on their own and in the afternoon sun drank a beer to try and cool off. At that point, the search continued for 4 days, included 250 personnel. That included 2 helicopters, about a dozen personnel on horseback, and in 1996 dollars, it was approximately $80,000 to conduct this search. Despite all of that, nothing additional was found. That beer bottle was the first and last clue found other than the van itself. Ultimately, the search was called off due to the fact that there was no chance that this group was alive anymore. It had been months since they had disappeared. And they also searched every way the Germans should have gone very thoroughly. This pretty fundamentally confused the National Park Service because they went every way that they figured anyone who would be in this type of situation would have gone, and they weren't able to find anything. After this, really no additional clues were found for quite some time. Next slide. So, possible explanations that were brought forward on their disappearance. One was that it was a staged disappearance. Egbert had a custody dispute with his ex-wife back in Germany, so it's considered that possibly he went to America with his girlfriend in order to discreetly start a new life and to stage their disappearance. The question, though, is why would you choose Death Valley for that? Because Death Valley is certainly a potential way to stage a disappearance, but it's also a very easy way to actually die and disappear. If they wanted to stage a disappearance, they could have staged a kidnapping or something else in like Las Vegas or Los Angeles, just disappeared from there. There's also been proposed there's a government conspiracy of some sort, that they were eliminated after seeing something they shouldn't. There were rumors many years after the fact from friends and family of Egbert that he was interested in hybrid propulsion, whatever that means, and that he was interested in some sort of secret facility close to Death Valley. However, that would likely be referring to Area 51, especially if it's like a German tourist who hasn't been to the United States. If they're thinking of like secret government projects, it's probably Area 51. And Area 51 isn't particularly close to Death Valley. China Lake Naval Weapons Station is very close to Death Valley. And it's unlikely that if you would have gone to the US to find some sort of secret government technology, he'd go to China Lake instead of Area 51. It's also been proposed that there were potential criminal elements. This is all pretty close to where the Manson followers lived, where the Manson Ranch was for their crimes back in the 60s. It was thought that maybe there were copycats or stragglers from the Manson group that still lived in the area, or maybe they're just random backcountry sociopaths that decided to kill them. However, nothing was taken from the van. Egbert's like identification and wallet and bank card and everything was still in the van. Nothing was taken. Also, this was in the middle of Death Valley. And the question is, what group of people would be hanging out in the middle of Death Valley looking to kill people? I mean, there are a lot better places to do it. And then the last proposed thing was that there's some sort of alien abduction. And that's kind of the, you've eliminated all other options. It's an easy solution. Unrelated, we have a photo of Bill Gates, who definitely didn't have anything to do with this. Next slide, please. So, enter Tom Hood. Tom is a retired engineer and amateur search and rescuer. That's a photo of him on the right. He has a background in, he has a master's degree in physics, and he studied a lot of, and did his thesis on exotic forms of propulsion. He was pretty quick to dismiss the Area 51 thing, mostly because all of the things that people said didn't make any sense. He operates the site otherhand.org, where he chronicles this case and a lot of other cases that he does. It's a very good site, very in-depth about investigating these types of cases. He's done a number of other cases quite like this. In 2009, he was intrigued by the mysteries of the case, the fact that there was really no new information found from 1996. And like the information I presented you was, up until he entered it, all of the information that was known. Despite the huge search, there was nothing additional known about it. He thought that all of the explanations I just talked about were very unlikely. And in order to kind of get his feel for what the Germans were going through, he drove to the area where they disappeared and walked by himself. So he went solo, and that was entirely so that he could get himself in their state of mind and not have someone who's familiar with the area kind of taint his thought process. Next slide, please. So the assumptions that Hood came up with was that they went south. This is kind of contrary to everything the National Park Service did during their search, because to the south was really nothing. The south was, if you wanted to find a way to definitely die if you were in their situation, going to the south was the way to do it. He assumed that they made a series of decisions that made sense in the moment to somebody who kind of had the limited knowledge of the area that they had, but that wouldn't make any sense to somebody who was experienced. He also figured that they didn't realize the gravity of their situation. They didn't realize that they were in any kind of survival situation until it was far too late, and that they were predominantly concerned with a number of factors which, for someone in a survival situation, would be fairly trivial. He thought that the biggest thing motivating them when they first got stuck was the fact that their van was due back on the 26th of July and their flight was on the 27th. Again, they checked into the national park on the 22nd and are thought to have gotten stuck on the 23rd. So he thought that for them, they weren't really thinking about how we're going to survive the situation. They were thinking about the fact that they needed to get back to Los Angeles by July 26th, which was 3 days. He also figured they were likely low on funds due to the fact that they wired for additional funds back in Germany, but they weren't sent any. So he figured that when the group first showed up to Death Valley National Park, that they predominantly wanted to do sightseeing in the area. However, they couldn't camp in the valley for a cheap rate because the valley is 126 degrees. It's not really possible to camp there in July. And they also couldn't rent a room at the lodge in Death Valley National Park because they didn't have any money. Therefore, for them to stay in the area, they would need to camp on one of the side canyons located on the edges of Death Valley National Park. Because again, the side canyons are quite a bit cooler than the main valley. It'd be a spot where they'd be able to camp, not be exposed to 120-degree temperatures, and also wouldn't really cost them any money. And he also figured that they wanted to see the sights of Death Valley, and then they wanted to head to Yosemite National Park, and then from Yosemite go back to Los Angeles. Basically exposing that they weren't incredibly familiar with the area and the geographic limitations of going straight from Death Valley to Yosemite and then Los Angeles, all within a scope of 3 days. It's a pretty big area to cover. Next slide, please. So again, he figured that they camped in the Western Valley side canyons, which again is by that mountain range that kind of sets the western edge of Death Valley National Park. He figures that while they were driving through that area, they encountered a number of dirt roads that were passable, but not great conditions. Something that could have passed with semi-competent driving a two-wheel drive vehicle, though. He thinks that upon seeing the various camps and cabins that they stopped at, they thought that they were like home or settlements or something, and they stopped at these cabins thinking that they could get kind of an assessment of what the roads were like further up, an assessment, people to kind of ask about if their plan was plausible. However, again, all of those locations were just shelters that were stocked, but they weren't actively lived in. So he figures that they continued on these questionable dirt roads, and they didn't turn back because the roads were so questionable, they didn't want to have to double back. Eventually, they reached a point where it was kind of their last moment to turn around right before they went through Anvil Canyon. And inspecting the maps that they had, it showed the roads that went through that area. However, if any of you are familiar with like GPS or maps from the Desert West, often they have roads that aren't actually like passable, that are listed. They aren't listed as anything other than normal roads. So they figured there's a normal road that went through Anvil Canyon. They figured that if they were to turn around at this point, they would need to double back in opposite of the direction that they had been through, and they wouldn't be able to get through Yosemite and to Los Angeles in time. So they decided the only way they'd be able to get back to Los Angeles in time was to head through Anvil Canyon, and ultimately, again, that's because they didn't want to return their van late. Next slide, please. So they eventually got stuck in Anvil Canyon, which again was nearly impassable in the van that they had. The cabins that they were at were fairly close, definitely the closest shelter that they had at only 4 miles away. However, the problem with going to the canyons that they most likely figured was they go to the canyon, sure, they have food and water, but they don't have a way out of Death Valley National Park. They didn't realize they were in a survival situation yet, and they figured, if survival wasn't on their mind, they were still concerned about getting to Los Angeles in time. If they got to the shelter that was close and was probably the best means of surviving, they wouldn't have any way to get the van out of the area, to contact people, to get back to Los Angeles in time. However, looking at their map, they realized that the China Lake Naval Weapons Center was only 6 miles south. The Germans were likely familiar with European-style bases, which are relatively small and have actively guarded perimeter fences with patrolling guards. So they probably figured that if they were able to make it the 8 miles, they'd come across patrol, let them know that they were stuck, and they'd be able to get help to get out of the area. What they failed to realize, though, is that China Lake is over 1 million acres. China Lake is actually over 1/3 of all of the land that the United States Navy owns, all in one location, and it is not protected by like a fence or patrolling guards. It's really protected by the vastness of the space that exists. If you look at the map, you see the dimensions on it are on the order of like hundreds of miles. I believe that, so a lot of that is airspace that's marking out, but I believe that China Lake itself is over 1,000 square miles. So again, they thought that this was potentially a way out, but it would be very, very unlikely that they'd come across anybody in the course of being in this area. Next slide, please. So Mahood actually, he basically just went south from where they were towards China Lake, and he found them. It took him a little bit of time, but it was really like that simple. So the photo on the right shows a wine bottle, which was the first indication he had that the Germans were in the area. They didn't really appear have any like water or anything with them, the Germans. They predominantly had like wine and beer. So that's what they were drinking as they were hiking across 100-degree Death Valley conditions. And then the photo on the left is the view looking south from where he found the Germans. So for the Germans, this was probably like the last view that they saw before they died. Again, they were close to China Lake, but there is still nothing that would indicate that they're anywhere close to it. Next slide, please. So the takeaways you can take from this is that if your plans break down in the wilderness, your life is the priority. That should ultimately, if you ever go out in the wilderness, your primary duty should be keeping yourself alive. Don't focus on trivial things like a van rental or a missed flight, expired parking, a job interview. These are all just potential examples of things that someone might care about getting out of the wilderness in time instead of just getting out alive. Also bring a reliable means of communication and essentials such as food and water. I know both Pat and I have like emergency responders that we bring with us when we're going backpacking. So we can basically just, if we're in a situation like this, just press a button and alert people. Also, if you're in Death Valley with a van, there's no reason not to have tens of gallons of water. Definitely don't bring just like a 30 rack with you and think that's good. Thomas Mahood, when he was doing all of these hikes, he carried at least 3 gallons of water with him at all times. So if you have a van and you're not worried about carrying weight, you definitely should do that. Next slide, please. But what if Thomas Mahood was wrong? Next slide. Now we're going to be going over missing 411. Next slide, please. So what is missing 411? It's a series of it's analysis by career lawman David Paulides, who that's a photo of him there, at the behest of alleged off-duty park rangers about national park disappearances. David here basically claims that he's a well enough lawman that he was approached by a number of national park rangers who told him there was something suspicious going on in national parks, and he wanted them, and they wanted him to look into it. So after doing his analysis, his verdict was there's definitely something suspicious happening at our national parks. And his big thing is he's just a man asking questions. He's not really, he, at least so far, hasn't really come up with any big solutions himself. He's just asking questions. And Missing 411 is his book series where he exposes all of these things. I think at this point there's like 8 books. And there's a movie. It's a big cash cow for him. Next slide, please. So his evidence is that the National Park Service doesn't maintain a national missing persons index. Basically, each national park has its own independent missing persons index, and they don't all communicate and collaborate with each other. He says that this is proof that the National Park Service is trying to cover up missing people. Others would say that it's more that disappearances in one national park aren't really all that relevant to disappearances in other national parks. Like a disappearance in Death Valley is not all that relevant to a disappearance in the Everglades because it's like a completely different area and climate. And also, people argue the National Park Service isn't predominantly a law enforcement agency, so they have pretty limited resources. So why would they invest it all into making this? But David says there's a lot of other things going on. One is that some remains are never found. He said there's no excuse for a missing person never being found, and even if that's in the middle of a national park, and that if they're not found, that means that something's going on. He also said that some people aren't where you'd expect them to be. Some people are miles away from where they disappeared or are at significantly higher elevations from where they disappeared. And he said this is all part of the nefarious plot that's going on. The photo on the right is one of the more famous missing 411 photos. Is basically the top is the dots of people who've gone missing in national parks, and the bottom are dots showing where all the caves are in the United States. So we'll get into it, but there are big parallels drawn between the caves and the missing people. Next slide. So who are the culprits who the missing 411 fanatics blame? The first one is Bigfoot, or even Big Feet. So Paul Eitz is the founder of the North American Bigfoot Search. Despite that, he only has one book that really explores in depth the connection that Bigfoot have to all these disappearances. He says that basically people in the wilderness have reported Bigfoot, and these Bigfoot have been aggressive towards humans. He also, people say the National Park Service doesn't want you to know about Bigfoot. This is for a number of reasons. One of the stranger ones is that the National Park Service doesn't want you to know about Bigfoot because Bigfoot is almost certainly an endangered animal, and that would cause additional environmental protections in national parks that the National Park Service doesn't want. That's a strange one from the sense that you would think the National Park Service would, like, if anyone would want additional protections. And also, there are already plenty of endangered animals in national parks already. So it's not like Bigfoot would fundamentally change that. And then the other side of the coin is that it's the government in general that doesn't want you to know about Bigfoot, because if it turns out Bigfoot's real, then that would mean that other conspiracy theories could be real too. It would validate a lot of conspiracy theorists if it turned out Bigfoot was real. Next slide, please. Ghosties and ghoulies have also been blamed. The top bullet point is a quote from one of the books. It was about a 60-something-year-old man who had disappeared on Mount Shasta after climbing in like the middle of a storm. And from the book, it said, according to local legend, beings called the Lemurians lived underneath Mount Shasta. Maybe the Lemurians got Carl. So Pat and I are actually considering climbing Mount Shasta this weekend, so we will definitely be on the lookout for Lemurians underneath the mountain. There's also a claim that all the disappearances are around caves, and that people who disappeared have eaten berries just beforehand. So on the right, I have a screenshot from a Reddit thread about someone who was asking what they could do in order to coax out whatever beings are kidnapping people, because he wanted to try and fight one. So basically the points are that whatever is going after people, you can't kill it, but there are things you can do to increase your odds of being taken. That is to go bow hunting, to not carry a weapon other than a bow, to go alone, to wear red, to go somewhere near boulders or other rock fields, near a body of water, to pick berries, to not bring a GPS device, and to not have a phone, to investigate strange things, and to carry a camera and take photos of nature. I would personally say a lot of those things are just things that are kind of like make you more likely to be lost. Like, you know, wandering near bodies of water or in boulder fields, like that just kind of increases your chance of being hurt. Not bringing a GPS device or having like any means of communication makes it so that, you know, if something happens, you're more likely to not get out. But what these people basically say is that there's some sort of subterranean race of elves or fairies or something that lives in the tunnels and caves underneath national parks, and they kidnap people that they feel are slighting nature. So what some people advocate is if you go on a hike in a national park, bring little pieces of candy that you place like around your campsite and things like that, because that will distract the elves and show them that you mean them no harm. It's kind of littering, I guess, but I guess the elves don't really care about that. But yeah, whatever you do, don't wear red. That's a big thing. And don't eat berries. Next, please. There's also potential there being some manner of national park serial killer. You know, I have an unrelated photo of some local men on the right. But maybe these serial killers are influenced by the zone of death that Leo talked about in a previous PowerPoint. The fact that some national parks might be in some sort of legal gray zone where you can get away with whatever you want. However, I guess the point against a national park serial killer is that it seems like a lot of work. One of the big points of missing 411 is that there's like no body or other evidence of the person having been there, which means that whoever's killing them would need to carry them all the way out of the national park or otherwise like dispose of them without someone finding in the national park. And like, I don't know, like the middle of a national park, if it's like, 30 miles in, you're talking about a couple of days of hiking just to like get to wherever you would do whatever nefarious acts you're doing, and then like carrying a body out. That would seem like a lot of work. This is like widespread all over the country is the claim. So, this person would need to be doing a lot of traveling. This definitely wouldn't be someone who has like, a 9 to 5 that they're doing and they just like kill on the weekends. This would be someone who's like a full-time serial killer. All they're doing is traveling all over the place. And like, if you wanted to do that, like, it seems like you could just like pick up drifters off the street or something like that a lot easier than like, hiking all the way into the middle of national parks where you don't even know if you're going to find somebody. Next slide, please. There's also, the skeptics who say nothing is happening, that the cases are statistically insignificant, that if you actually compare the number of missing people in a national park compared to like the national number of missing people, you're not really that likely to go missing in a national park. And that, if you compare it to any other outdoor area, it's the exact same, chances of going missing. That most of the cases are in fact explained by poor prep, weather, injuries. One of David's things is that a lot of these disappearances happen right before really bad weather, which proves there's a nefarious component to it, and not just that it proves that people aren't good at surviving in bad weather. He also does things like, there was one national park where 3 women whose first name started with A and only had 3 letters in their name disappeared. Therefore, whatever serial killer is going after them is following them because of their name, or maybe the elves and fairies know their names and only go after these people. They also say the National Park Service is not a law enforcement agency, so you can't really blame them for not like doing a lot of forensic analysis or having great means of tracking who's gone missing. This, however, is a very boring explanation. There's not really any fun to it. Next slide, please. Are there any questions?
So the German couple, he found the bodies, or
so he found bones, and then the bones were, through forensic analysis, determined to be a couple of the like same age that disappeared.
Okay.
But it could be that the national park serial killer killed them and then dumped other bodies there. Who knows?
Didn't he also find the girlfriend's like full wallet?
Yeah, so that was actually like I said, if you go to otherhand.org, they go into a lot more depth. But basically, they found the wallet of the girlfriend, and when they trekked out, they carried that with them to like prove to the National Park Service that they weren't just like some random crazy dudes who were claiming to find bones. Because like they found plenty of like donkey bones and things like that. So they wanted to like prove, no, we actually, found something here. He actually said that, so the FBI went out too, and they needed to give an alibi for what it was. Tom Hood and a buddy of his went out. They needed to provide an alibi for 1996 to prove that they weren't somehow associated with it. Because I guess the thinking was basically, they could be guys who murdered them and then waited until 20 years later to like bring
Perfect
investigators back. Yeah, go back to the scene of the crime.
I noticed a lack of theories about human trafficking in here.
So Missing 411, I don't think really talks about human trafficking.
Yeah, I was expecting much more on the cave systems that connect all the national parks and things like that.
Yeah, so that there is like really, so all of this is like a Reddit community that this is all about, and there's like not a lot of information other than that graph of missing persons compared to caves. So then there was somebody who want to disprove that, so they did a very, very similar thing, which was missing persons versus Walmart locations, and the map looked almost exactly the same.
I'd also
Yeah, I
think
guess.
a lot of those are like suicides or something, like people don't want to be found.
Well, I mean, most of it, like, if you want to talk about someone is far away from where they were missing, or they're at a higher elevation, like, there is documented evidence that when someone is lost, they tend to head, like, in directions, either up or downhill. And that is, like, uphill is so that they can see higher, so they can try to get, like, a vantage point from where they are. And downhill is just that it's tend to thought that downhill leads towards civilization. I mean, it's, if you, like another thing that the missing 411 people say is that there were people that they were in really bad weather, but they took clothes off, which is like proof that some sort of entity was taking the clothes off them. But there's like a lot of, analysis and proof that when people have hypothermia, they take clothes off because they feel really hot. It's basically people who don't really know what they're talking about seeing these things and thinking that it can't just be that people go missing in the wilderness, and thinking that there need to be some sort of supernatural explanation. But again, there's not really any proof, which again is,
How much like is animal? I don't know if there's like a difference between, like, let's say a Death Valley National Park to like a more foresty national park where you might have your bigger animals like wolves or bears or even like mountain lions that someone goes out by themselves, they end up getting attacked, they can't fight it off, they end up getting killed by it.
So I
And
think that, like, most big animal attacks are rare enough that I don't think they really significantly alter the number of people who are, like, lost. Like, I think it's like in some areas the number of, like, fatal, like, some national parks, like, the number of fatal animal attacks from, like, the big predators is, like, single digits over, like, decades.
Okay.
So those are, like, really rare. I think, like, if you compare to the number of people who just get lost in general, it's a lot higher than that. But again, like, the people who are the missing 401 people say the things that make you more likely to be, like, attacked by the supernatural are the things that just make you more likely to get lost. Like, you're by yourself without proper equipment and without any means of communication or, like, a GPS. And those are the things that draw the elves to you. And not just, like, those are the things that make you more likely to, like, break your leg and have no means of getting out. And I think too, like, one of the big things we say we're missing 401 is, why don't we find these people? And, like, there are people who get lost in, like, urban settings and it takes them months to be found. Like, there are cases of people who, like, they're lost within 200 yards of their house. They, like, wander into a culvert or something and they're never found. Or they're not found for, like, months. So to think that, like, a national park that's hundreds of square miles, you're just going to, like, miraculously find everybody is pretty foolish.
I've often wondered about the search techniques and the effectiveness of these, like, missing person searches in the woods, of, how they actually, like, coordinate and execute those, so that way you have a reasonable chance of finding someone. Because in my mind, like, if someone intentionally or unintentionally just wanders off a path, like, the chance of finding them is almost, like, zero.
So there's actually a pretty good amount of research. That was actually one of the previous presentations I was planning on doing, was missing person tracking. And there's a lot of research done into, like, the types of things that people do when they are, in terms of, like, what geographical features they follow and things like that. And there are actually some pretty surprising conclusions from it. I think I've talked to you about this before, Pat. Actually, very little correlation between how long someone's been missing from the original location they were missing that they're found. Mm-hmm. And that's thought to be for, like, a number of reasons. One is, that people tend to wander in circles. So it's actually very difficult for them to make any real headway unless they have, like, a geographic landmark they're working toward. Another one is, if someone is lost, they're very unlikely to make any significant progress in any direction. If they knew, like, if they had good bearing and direction for where they were supposed to be going, they'd be able to make good distance, but they probably wouldn't be lost either.
When we got trained in Boy Scouts, we did like the fan out thing where you get like 40 people or whatever parallel in a line, and they basically say they give the two people on the edges compasses to make sure that they don't send everybody walking in a circle. I have no idea how legit the training I got was or not. I mean, it was Boy Scouts, it was like actual people training us, but I don't know. But
Yeah, the walking in circle things is believed to be due to differences in leg length.
Yeah.
Because your legs are slightly different lengths. So if you think you're doing an even gait, you are doing like a very slight uneven gait, and that causes you to drift over time. I think most of the research on that is like you put a blindfold on someone, you tell them to walk straight. And if you do that to somebody, like almost everybody ends up just walking in circles. And if you measure their leg, they walk in the direction of whatever their shorter leg is.
Isn't there some kind of similar statistic where the rate, I guess, of people either disappearing or dying, probably dying, is also like does not correlate with their level of experience or inexperience in the outdoors? Like if you're inexperienced, you're probably just as likely, or if you are experienced, you're just as likely as someone that's inexperienced. So like,
I don't know directly on that, but I do know that I think like the biggest indicating factor on whether you'll be found again is like the size of the group, if I'm recalling the book correctly. I think the size of the group is the like single biggest factor in your likelihood to be found alive or dead. Like a solo person who is lost, that's like the biggest factor for someone disappearing.
yeah, because I saw this thing about this guy who got lost in like upstate New York, and he, like, I guess per some training that was, back in the 70s or 80s or whatever, they said like, oh, if you're lost, like stay put. That way, like rescuers have a better chance of finding you. So he like set up his camp and just like stayed put and like ate berries and drank out of like the local water. And he was there for like over 3 weeks. And eventually like he died of like giardia or whatever, just from drinking bad water, where they were like, hey, like in 3 weeks, you can walk across the state of New York. Like he could have easily like gotten to a highway, but for his training, he just like stayed put.
Yeah, I think that most of the advice, if you are lost, is to try and orient yourself to a known landmark that you know is like a landmark that you know is near like a trail or some other type of feature, and then once you get back to the trail or the feature, follow that. Because I think like the staying put thing is like if you have absolutely no idea where you are, and have no possible means of getting anywhere. Yeah, what was I gonna say? Yeah, I think too when it comes to the experience thing, like a lot of the information on the experience comes from like friends and family members who don't really have any real idea of what they're talking about. Like they might know that their cousin goes on hikes every once in a while and think that makes them like a seasoned survivalist, or like they have no idea what type of gear the person actually brought, because even someone who's like really experienced, if they don't have like a normal setup,
like if you were to ask my parents my level of proficiency, they would say like, oh yeah, he's like an expert mountaineering like guy, but I'm very much like novice like novice plus.
Yeah,
in terms of what's out there. That makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, if you go to a national park, watch out. Don't wear red. Don't eat berries. Pat and I ate berries when we did the Sol Duke hike in Olympic National Park.
Yeah, now that I think about it, I think that's the reason I crashed your car. Is I had some kind of madness from the berries that the fairies were trying to take me.
I think that's one of the things they say is that people are lured by berries that basically put them in some sort of coma, which makes them easier to abduct by the fairies and elves. I don't know. I guess my question would be, like, there are a lot of people who go spelunking and things like that. why don't they like constantly find evidence of fairies and elves and things like that? You know, like all of those caves that are marked off must be proof that someone has gone through them, right?
Interesting.
Any other questions?
I guess like, is there like because I've my experience with national parks is very, very, very tertiary because I don't really like once in a blue moon we'll go to like a national park.
Mm.
Like, do most national parks have like trails and defined trails and all that stuff? Could that be correlation of, all right, it might be a national park, but some are much more likely if you don't know which, like, if there's not a actual path for you to travel to, that much more likely for you to get lost in.
Yeah, so most national parks kind of have like two systems. They have like an established campground and lodge system, which is actually what most people who go to a national park are more familiar with, where it's like established permanent shelters and things like that. And then in addition to that, most of them have like trails and things like that then go into like the back country. There are a few exceptions to that, particularly in like the Alaskan national parks that have nothing. They don't even have trails. But for most national parks, that's kind of what it is. So generally what you have is you have people who aren't as experienced with backcountry stuff kind of stick to the lodges and the campgrounds. The people who are more experienced with backcountry tend to go into the backcountry. So yeah, that's the way that it normally works from my experience.
Those trails are typically like more established than like your national forest or like BLM land kind of stuff. Like they're
but
usually
even in the national parks, as you get further out, the trails get worse and worse. Like when Pat and I did the hike through Hoh Rainforest in last summer, like within 2 miles of the Hoh Rainforest campground, it was like super flat, like 10-foot wide trails. But then eventually, once we got like 20 miles away from the campground, it was like there were signs saying that you couldn't take a horse and that if you wanted a pack animal, it needed to be an alpaca because of like how rugged the trail was. So, it's very different and it's, a much steeper grade at that point. Um, so I think most of these are disappearances that happen in the backcountry areas, which are not quite as accessible. And the thing too is, when we were really far out, we'd maybe see a person every half hour or hour, and we were on a pretty popular trail when we did that. So there are definitely areas you can hike in the backcountry of national parks where you might see a couple people every day or nobody. So if you get into some sort of bad situation out there, if you break your leg, there's a decent chance that
You'll die.
yeah, you'll die if you don't have another person or some means of communication.
When I was at Boundary Waters, I was on a lake that I think had either 3 or 4 campsites around it. And so one of the days we saw one other person the whole time, which is pretty rad. But it's that, and that is like still places that normal people like me go to instead of like actual outdoorsy people. Although Boundary Waters is a little different than Death Valley.
Yeah, when I went to Stanislaus, Hannah and I went, which is north of Yosemite, there was a bunch of cars in the parking lot, like when we got to the trailhead, but we saw one person the entire time, for like 3 days of backpacking.
Nathan, what's the deepest you've been in Wildy?
I think when Pat and I went to Blue Glacier, we did 40 miles in like 2 days. And yeah, so we were the closest we could be. Like when we were really deep in, it was like a day of pretty arduous hiking to get to where we were, and we were 20 miles away from the nearest road.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you do that hike off season, because we did it in July, so there was a pretty decent number of people. If you do that in October or November, you know, you're like, and you lose the trail, or like for a lot of the hike, it was just like, you know, if you slipped off the trail, it was, you know, hundreds of foot drop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're done for, and there's a pretty good chance no one finds you, because, you know, if all they know is you disappeared somewhere on a 20-mile trail, like there's not really much they can do with that.
Are these missing 411 like numbers of where people go missing, reports of where people go missing legit at all, or?
So they are. So there was a data scientist that basically just like randomly picked people and was able to determine they are real people who disappeared. But it's stuff like, you know, the guy who disappeared on Mount Shasta was a guy in his 60s who was with a group, got separated from the group when a storm was rolling in, and was never seen again.
Yeah.
So, like, a logical explanation is basically he got stranded in the storm and he was like an old guy, so he died. But, you know, the conclusion, you know, Koreans or whatever it is that live under the mountain that kidnapped him. Again, like, he uses the fact that a storm rolls through as like proof that there's something not like, you know, a storm rolling in both answers how the person died and why you never found them, because a storm may have erased whatever trace existed of that person being there. And also, I guess, like, the guy himself is like a shyster, the David Paulides. Like, he does whatever he can. So he claims he's there to, like, seek the truth and ask questions and, like, figure out what's going on. But he has, like, any digital copy of the book that's circulated, he's, like, immediately taken down. He only sells print copies of the book because he wants to, like, maximize his cash flow. He's, like, really like, he's written 8 books and has a movie, and he's never really, like, put forward what he thinks is actually going on, because he's trying to, like, draw out the sales. And then, like, if you go to the Reddit for it, it's just, like, a bunch of delusional people. Like, people who unironically say that they bring, like, whistles and hard candies with them into the woods that they can offer to the fairies so that they don't get kidnapped.
It's awesome.
Any other questions?
I got nothing.